I mentioned a few moments ago that other farmers may have taken advantage of my dad. Well, he needed a horse and wagon even before he had cows and so forth. Someone advised him to buy a certain horse, not a heavy work type horse, but a light work type horse, named Lady. Lady was a lady, a curious lady, a circus lady. She could not work. My mother told me stories about Lady jumping over fences or anything she saw dared to jump over. She did. I was only a few months old when we arrived in Salem. That summer my mother put me outdoors in a cradle to sleep. Lady saw her opportunity to try out her jumping. Again and again she jumped over me in the cradle. Back and forth she would go as my mother stood horrified. Of course, this supposed circus horse had a good time, but my mother didn't. She was very careful from then on not to place her baby within sight of Lady. Whatever finally happened to Lady, I don't know. I think my father finally sold her because she was useless to a farmer. That same summer, while I was sleeping under the shade of a tree, very contented, as all little 5 or 6 month babies can be, my mom forgot to check on me. The sun shone brighter and hotter and hotter and hotter, and I was completely at the mercy of its heat. I was so sunburned that my mom used to say she feared for my life. I was completely blistered. It doesn't take too much for an infant to be severely sunburned, as I was. To top this, I was not yet a year old when I got the measles. Again, my mother worried for my life as I was completely covered with the heavy rash. There were no vaccinations or shots for that then. You simply suffered it out, hoping all would work out well. People considered measles quite lightly then. They don't do so now. Walter and Bill had the measles also, but not as bad as I did. After Uncle John and family moved back to Pennsylvania, my parents decided to move from our end of the house to the other end where my Uncle John and family had lived. By that time, I must have been about 4 years old. I remember very vividly living in our rooms, and then I remember the other rooms too, but I don't remember the move. It's all a blank, a blur to me. My mother still baked bread in the wall oven of the old kitchen, which had a sink from which a pipe went out through the outside wall of the house, thus draining sink water out into the open. The water merely flowed away. There were no cesspools or anything of that type to catch it. Both kitchens were very large and roomy. Wooden floors, no linoleums. These floors had to be scrubbed with very tough bristle brushes. They didn't stay clean very long, but that was the life then. Everybody had to scrub wooden floors. When I was a little girl, and even when I left the farm at age 21, there was very little fear of anyone breaking into the house for the purpose of stealing or pilfering. We never had to lock our doors. In fact, I don't remember ever having any keys for that purpose. The doors were always open, even when we were away. all the people in our neighborhood felt the same way. One day, after hearing a story about a thief, my brother Bruno and I worried about it so much that our imagination ran away with us. Bruno was about 4 and I 5 or so. We were about a year and a half apart in age. My mother and father were away somewhere, perhaps visiting friends. I don't know where the older boys were, but Bruno and I were frightened and were afraid to enter the house. We told each other that there was a bad man in our kitchen, the kitchen with the wool oven. We decided to defend ourselves against this supposed burglar. We gathered rocks and started throwing them through the open door into the house. You see, we were sure that he, the burglar, opened the door and was still in there. I don't know how many rocks we threw, but the kitchen floor was covered. Of course, no one came out of there, for there was no one in there. We were sure we killed him, but we're still afraid to go in. About that time, my mother and father drove into the yard in the wagon to find us still throwing rocks. "What are you doing?" they said. "Look at all those rocks in the old kitchen. Why did you do it?" We explained about the boogie story, and they laughed at us. "There is no such thing as a boogeyman. Don't listen to such stories. We are perfectly safe here, so don't be afraid." They took us inside and through the rooms to prove to us that there was no one there. We thought that the bad man must have run out the back door, but of course it was not so. Now we had a job to clean out all the rocks that were inside the kitchen. Now I must impress you here that we never locked our doors, never. We were very trusting. Every year, at least several times, a hobo would come through the neighborhood to beg for food and lodging, staying only a night or two. We called these men bums. We fed these men and let them sleep in the barn on the hay with only a blanket to sleep on. Usually, the men offered to chop wood or do some other chore to repay the kindness. Then they would go on to another place further away. We usually gave them sandwiches to take along. We were never afraid of mischief from these men, nor a fire from cigarettes. It was a natural thing to do then to help the roving hobo. Who would ever do that these days? Even out in the country where we used to live, everyone locks doors now. It's a pity that that trust is no longer there as it used to be.